Hello and welcome to SOUQ Paulse. It's always a delight. Once this time of the day draws close and the time hits 4, for those in Nigeria and West Africa, this is the time where we'll talk. I will tell you the same thing. We don't have that extra baggage to keep quiet. And whatever it is, wherever it's coming from, whoever is involved, the businesses, the banks, the losses, the gains, the conflict, the agreements, the disagreements, those signing, we talk. Because when we keep quiet, that is when there is trouble. But as long as we talk, then solutions are not far. And on SOUQ Paulse, we talk. My name is Chooks, John Rogers Chooks, and I'm glad to be here live on SOUQ News. We are all about positivities. So come, sit, settle, and detox. Today on SOUQ Paulse, we will be going to Asia. You heard me right. And we'll ask some good questions. We will talk about some things that is happening. Positive, yes. Not too positive yet. But we'll talk. We'll go on a very short break. When we return, I will introduce our topic and also our guest, who happens to be an expert in this particular field. Your Excellencies, don't go anywhere. SOUQ Paulse will be right back. Welcome back. This is SOUQ Paulse, and we're live on SOUQ News, where we tell you all things are possible to them that believe. Now, where are we heading to? We are going to loans. And to be specific, we're looking at Chinese loans. And we're asking ourselves, how can Africa avoid every one of the pitfalls we've had with the Bretton Woods institutions with these Chinese loans? That's where we are heading to. If we want to say we are going to make progress, we are going to get productive, yes, we will need money to develop. We need money to build. We need money into infrastructure. But are these monies going to where they are intended? Is it going to be devoid of any trap? Is it going to be payable? Is it going to be profitable, both to lender and we that are using it? Now, let's get to that particular place where we get to talk, because this is another institution. This is another nation. And we don't want a repeat of what has happened to Africa over time with IMF, with World Bank, and some other Western nation banks and international money-giving organizations. We are indebted to the neck. Now China is here. Let's talk. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, to join us on this particular discussion today is the Executive Director of African China Center for Policy and Advisory. Join me as I welcome to SOUQ Paulse for the first time, Mr. Paul Frimpong. You're welcome to SOUQ Paulse.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And giving us this time. Now, let's get straight into this discussion. Now, China has been the highest lender of late to developing African nations. There is no gainsaying about that. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative started by President Xi Jinping has also provided loans for infrastructural projects right from 2013, when that project came upstream, to 2023. Over $700 billion has been signed, both for deals that are ongoing and those that will start and those that are yet to start. And this statistic is coming from the Ministry of Commerce in Beijing. Africa will smile with these figures. Looking at infrastructure, some built, some not built, some completed, some yet to start. Africa will also smile. But now let's start this way. This humongous amount of money is not free. It's a loan. Is it burdensome on Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to join you to have this very important conversation. In recent times, if you're tracking the development stories in and around Africa, you come across the issue about debts and debt sustainability. These are terms that are used to measure the economic development journey of countries or regions. These are terms that are accepted, globally when we say debt sustainability, and it's there for a purpose. The reason is that countries around the world are at different stages of development, and it's also understood that no one country can develop without a combination of debts and, of course, its own assets, as we call it, internally generated funds, as well as getting funds from outside through raising of debt. It is an established norm that you may have to fall on debt related instrument to be able to raise the kind of financing that you need to develop your economy. And so, as we speak today, the most indebted country in the world is also the number one country economy in the world, which is the United States of America, which is in over 30 something trillion of dollars. So it's the most indebted country in the world, yet is the number one economy in the world. So that's the conversation that we have when we talk about debt sustainability. Now, in the context of countries in Africa, debt sustainability, what we are saying is that for countries in these categories of developing countries category or late developing countries, there's a threshold, and this threshold is pegged against your gross domestic product, which is your GDP. So, for example, a country like Ghana, like Nigeria, and all countries in Africa, the threshold is that at every point in time, your debt level should not be 60% above your GDP. So that's the debt to GDP ratio, 60%.
Okay,
if you
now,
go
Mr.
above
Paul,
that,
let
are
me
moved to
hold
the
you.
threshold
Let me
of
hold you on
call.
that. Let me hold you on that. Now, I like your analogy when you talked about the US being one of the highest debtors. Good, that's on paper. I also like your analogy where you say it's one of the highest grossing nation when it comes to productivity. Good, that's on paper. Now let's bring it back home to African countries. If we want to toe the line of the US, are we 10% as productive as they are to accumulate the amount of debt we are taking on ourselves?
So that is the conversation we are having now. Okay, so I was trying to bring it down, right? So in the context of Africa, as long as you're doing above 60% of your GDP, your debt level is above 60%, it's called unsustainability. And that is unfortunately where we find most countries in Africa. And in fact, my own country, Ghana, we are doing almost 90% of our GDP. Okay. Now, in the context of whether we have the capacity to pay or to be able to offset, some countries have been able to do, some countries have not. Example again, Ghana, we were not able to meet our debt obligations. That is why even now we are in the IMF program, the IMF bailout, because we had to restructure the debt that we owe to domestic investors and also do external debt restructuring to external creditors. But again, we also need to understand that we also need to be allowed to interrogate the components of the debts that are accumulated by these countries individually. Because if we box everything together, we might miss the main point. And when we pick a country and we want to analyze the debt levels of these countries, might have debts up to about 90% or 110%, and they might be in Africa. But if you can track the component of the debt that they owe, vis-a-vis even the maturity period of these loans, and also what these monies are used for, okay, you can appreciate the fact that maybe this country for about 3, 5, 7, 10 years maximum, they can move from the 110% or 90% of GDP to about 50 or 60% when these debts have matured in 10 years' time. Okay, so we have to allow ourselves to interrogate these country-specific cases in terms of the debt levels before we can understand whether indeed the countries have the capacity or not. Of course, in most countries, like in Ghana, like in Zambia, like in Ethiopia, and all of that, it has shown that these countries did not have the capacity to meet the debt obligations when these debts are maturing. In these cases, that is why eventually they have to default. In fact, we defaulted on our debt obligation, paying of interest or even paying off interest be defaulted, let alone paying off a part of the principal. So then we have to restructure what we call a debt restructuring that we've gone through before we had to get an IMF bailout.
And when the management, who happen to be my bosses, who happen to be your friends, told me that, hey, reach out to Mr. Paul Frimpong and you are in good hands. Indeed, I am really seeing that I am in good hands. Now, let's hit this while it's still very hot. Less than 2 weeks ago, African leaders went to China and they met with the president. Although a lot of countries, it was not that advertised, but we got to see that presidents of several African countries went to China. And they came back with news. More debt. At the rate we are going, before we start looking at individual countries, is this where we should start playing? Because if we have to aggregate as a continent and head to a particular place, which means somebody has strength over others, are we playing the game the way it should be played? Or we are still following empty belly business to deal with other people?
So for the perspective of China, I mean, and in the case of Africa, in terms of where we are as a continent and the kind of development assistance or support that we need, it's more of becoming a chicken and egg situation. The reason is that as we speak today in Africa, one of the key challenges that has been identified, of course, is about investing in critical infrastructure. As we speak today, 600 million people, which is almost half of the continent population, or even half of the continent population, do not have access to electricity. Almost 500 million people do not have access to clean drinking water. When we talk about railway development across the world, the global average is 23 kilometers per 1,000 square meter. In Africa, it's just only 2.3 kilometers per 1,000 square kilometer. Internet accessibility, investment in healthcare. Right? So on the onset, there's a huge gap. In fact, on paper, upon all the researches and all the recommendations that has come from our own institution, not from foreign institutions, from the regional bodies, like from the African Development, even from our own Africa Continental Future Area, we talk about building a common market, 1.4 billion market. The bottom line is that we need connectivity. Connectivity here talks about infrastructure investment. In fact, Agenda 2063 of the African Union, we have 7 aspirations. Aspiration number 2 talks about building world-class infrastructure crisscrossing across the continent. Indeed, we need between $130 billion to $170 billion each year for the next 10 years and above to invest in infrastructure if we want to move the continent to the next level, which is very key. So that is the gap we are talking about. So there's a huge gap.
Okay, I agree with you. I agree with you that we need that much to move the continent or the various countries to the next level. But now the same question is this: are we going to depend on other countries or depend on loans to get this done? What happened to Africa waking up and counting? What happened to Africa coming to the market and bringing goods to sell? What happened to Africa just not being the seller of raw product?
Yes.
Why are we always hand in mouth, cap in hand, heading outside Africa to go collect monies for this same thing we keep talking about, infrastructure, like the West or Asia owe us? Do they?
Yeah, so we also have to understand that, again, that is why in the first instance, I didn't mention about the US example, China example, all of them, right? It's at every point in time and the level of capacity that you have and the kind of assistance that you need. In fact, that's why almost every country in Africa has investment promotion authorities, or them IPAs, right? I'm sure Nigeria has investment promotion center trying to woo investors to come into Nigeria. We give you tax exemptions in days, we give you tax cap. It is a norm. I mean, the fact that you want to develop yourself, you want to have your own resources, it is the first thing, of course, that we call for. The country must build internal capacity to raise funding, at the regional level, at the continental level to do that. But that is never enough, right? So the strategy is how to find a balance, okay, between what you can generate internally and what development assistance can open to you, reasonably tapping into that based on your own capacity and ability to meet the obligations of these kind of assistance that are available to be able to balance that together with your own internally generated funds, whether at the country level or regional level, at the ECOWAS or maybe at the continental level, to be able to meet the needs as we have it. So clearly, it is shown that countries in Africa do not have the much capacity. We have capacity, but not to the level that we think, based on our own only resources that we have at home, we can build these billions of dollars of infrastructure that we have. We have what it takes to leverage on what it takes, what we have to get what we want, which is what you mentioned. Of course, we have Africa is endowed with enough resources. The conversation has to then shift as to what we are putting on the table in taking on these resources, in taking on these kind of debt that we are taking on. In fact, one of the brilliant things that came up, even what China called the debt for infrastructure deals, that infrastructure resource for infrastructure deal that China proposed, and in fact some countries proposed and China adopted, which for me was revolutionary, because what is the cycle that we have? So, for example, Ghana, we take gold in the raw form, we sell it, people take the gold. Of course, the gold itself is the majority of the gold that is mined in Ghana are mined by companies that are from outside. In fact, the largest mining companies in Africa, not even talking about that, the largest mining companies in Africa are not African companies. They are foreign companies. In mining companies in Africa are foreign companies. They take the gold, refine it, and then there's the 1 to 10% that the government have. They bring it back, and then we have to go and look for contractors, mostly from outside, and then we pay them back with the money that we have. But if you are just exchanging your resources right from the onset for this infrastructure that we need, it's more like, of course, you're not going to get 100% of the value of the resources as we have, but that could be more than just the 5% royalties that you have in the gold that is taken from your country, and then you have to wait for that 5% to come back. You have the dollars, then you have to go and look for contractors to come and construct a road for you. But this one is a direct exchange. So for me, those are the innovative ways that we are promoting and also advocating for, that we can find a way. In fact, there are a lot of regional connectivity projects that are left hanging between countries that we believe countries can come together, mobilize resources together to embark on those things. Of course, in that stance, you can get some support from international assistance.
Before we get
the
to
whole
those
idea
particular
is
relationships within Africa, let's break this down a bit. Now, a country like Kenya is owing China well over $8 billion. Now, Kenya has also gone for loan restructure. They've also gone to ask for more. They've also, at a point in time, they couldn't even pay. As we speak, we are looking at not making the same mistake that we've made with the Bretton Woods organizations. But right now, are we not falling in the same pitfalls that we've fallen before? What's the difference?
Well, so for me, I think when you talk about debts and of course China, there's a lot being said. There's a lot being written about the kind of relation that is existing between African countries and China when it comes to loans. And of course, one of them being about the issue about the debt trap. I think that's the question that you're asking, whether we are not being trapped the same way Bretton Woods institution, trapped most countries, in the past. There's something that I call borrower responsibility, and that is the thing that we try to advocate for, that countries that are taking on these loans have their own core responsibility in managing the sort of debt that they are taking on. When you track the debt conversation when it comes to Africa and China debt, in some ways, the conversation has been that most countries in Africa are in debt crisis because of China. The fact actually is the opposite, and it's not true that countries are defaulting because you mentioned about Kenya. Kenya's, of all the total external debts of Kenya, China's own is just about 4% of it. Just 4% of Kenya's total external debt is owed to China. In the case of Ghana, it is around 6% of our total external debt. So when we're having issues about price of debt in recent time that we have to go to the IMF, the debt component that we owe to China out of our total external debt was just 6%. So the 94% of our total external debt is actually not about China, really. Of course, it is a known fact that China was the single largest, creditor to Ghana when it comes to that component. But in percentage-wise, it was just 6%. In the case of Kenya, it's around 4-5% of total external debt of Kenya. In the entire continent of Africa, China's total external debt, Africa's total external debt when it comes to China is around 12% of our total external debt as a continent. So for me, it's a working, tightrope that we need to work on. The fact is that we need this financing, but we have to be strategic as countries. We need to be innovative around it. The fact that monies are available to be tapped into doesn't mean that we should just open up our arms and just take on that which we don't even have the capacity to pay back. So for me, that is the conversation that we need to have when it comes to the debt situation in the countries in Africa and then China.
Thank you very much. Now let's take this conversation a little bit further. Now we get to see narrative coming from the West, and China gets the good bashing, be it from the EU, be it from the States, be it from every one of them across the Atlantic. China gets the good bashing when it comes to Africa. On the same hand, they are also investing and bringing up new initiative to counter the Road and Belt Initiative of China. US have the Global Infrastructure and Investment. What's it called? EU have the Global Gateway. Now, the question is coming this way. If Africa is the one that is being courted, if Africa is the one that the bride everybody wants to get married to, there is something they are all profiting, definitely. Why is Africa not using this to her own advantage?
Well, it's an ongoing development. I mean, you referenced the earlier event that was held in Beijing. In fact, it is the kind of event that, in fact, more African leaders or countries represent more than the UN General Assembly as it happens. So you have over 50 governments, heads of state, and leaders from 50 African countries in Beijing, the largest, more than they even attend UN General Assembly. Now, it is a known fact that the engagement, the continued engagement between Africa and China is actually something that has also continued to spark a lot of interest from other parts of the world, including, of course, the intensified interest now from the US in Africa. Now we have the US Africa Leaders Summit, the first one was held in, I think, 2008 or so. And then President Biden just held one in December 2022. Now we don't know when they're going to, there are a lot of other Africa Plus One summitry, as we put it, a lot of engagement, whether at a country level or regional level, Arab Africa Summit, the UK Africa Business Summit, the EU, and all of that, trying to engage more with the continent. For me, I think it's a brilliant set of an interest that we have to find a way to leverage on these interests to actually find our feet in the global stage. It is a known fact that China's continuous interest in Africa and this continent, of course, as you mentioned about the global gateway to counter the BRI, which is a core part of what Africa is also aspiring to achieve, which is about building connectivity, putting real hard currency in infrastructure development, which is what the BRI is about. So if in the course of these new momentum, new interests being re-energized from the EU, from the US, from other Western allies, of course, that could be a good point where Africa can actually leverage on these for development. As to whether that is happening now, we will live to see, because we've not really seen any tangible commitment from these other initiatives, as you referenced earlier, from the Global Gateway or other from the US, in terms of even in December, the US government promised about $5 billion of investment to African countries. Now we live to see if that $5 billion will actually be available for African countries to leverage on to develop. So for me, it is a welcoming development that shows that we still are relevant, in shaping the global world. In fact, there's a lot of angles, economic interest, of course, geopolitical interest as well. As we speak now, China is seeking to build a very strong relationship with countries in the global south. China wants to be the leading voice, leading, economy when it comes to countries in the global south. And guess what? Over 54 countries of those countries in the global south are in Africa, of course, except Eswatini, that do not have diplomatic relations with China. That is a whole 54 countries that can back China's initiatives around the world. In fact, China has introduced a lot of new initiatives, like the Global Civilization Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, and building a global community, a shared future. These are all initiatives led by China that requires that there has to be a backing of a huge bloc like in Africa. Of course, the same way from the US and other European allies that are also trying to match up with this level. It is up to us. And of course, they cannot. And let's take on the fact that none of these will put Africa's interest first above their interest. We have to understand that fact.
Okay,
It
now
has to
you're saying this with your full chest, and I like that. None of them will put Africa's interest first. Like with your full chest, and I'll say it again, I like that. Now, we are going to go on a very short break. But before we hit that button, I want to ask you this particular question, and I want just a yes or a no answer. Then we'll go on this break. Now, cumulatively, Africa profile countries' debt profile is a bit scary. This was as of 2020. Angola was owing China 42 billion. As of 2020, Ethiopia 13.7. Nigeria 7.3 as of 2020. Now, this is 4 years later. I don't want to go into those figures. Now, let me ask you this particular question, why I don't want to go into those figures. So just answer me a yes or no. Should we be scared?
Yes, of course. I mean, debt has to be interrogated properly. Yes, we should be worried about these numbers, of course.
Now, with this, we'll go on a very short break. When we return, we will take this discussion a notch further. You that is collecting, what are you doing with the money? Don't go anywhere. SOUQ Paulse will be right back. We must make sure that we are heard. Talk to your leaders. Make sure that wherever we take these monies from, they are used judiciously and people are accountable for them. So, Mr. Paul, you're welcome back. Welcome back from the break. This is still SOUQ Paulse. Now we are taking this a bit further. We've talked about the loans. We've talked about some other issues. Now let's ask this directly. Chinese loans are majorly infrastructure loans. Loans from the Bretton Woods institutions are still majorly policy-driven loans. Which is better, the infrastructure loans or the policy-driven loans?
I mean, of course, that is why earlier on I did mention that when you talk about the debt-related issues, sometimes we need to be allowed to interrogate what those monies are used for. In the case of most countries in Africa, what we're calling for is the kind of loans that goes to invest in the critical infrastructure. As we speak now, China is the largest investor in Africa's infrastructure. In fact, when you combine the next 8 lenders together, when it comes to infrastructure investment in Africa, China investment is $8 billion more than the next 8 lenders combined. And here are the components of the next 8 lenders. You have the World Bank, you have the IFC, you have the KfW, you have the African Development Bank. All these development agencies and banks, when you combine their investment in Africa between 2007 and 2020, it is still short of $8 billion compared to what China has invested in African infrastructure. Again, as you already mentioned, China's investment in Africa goes into infrastructure. Loans that country take from Africa goes into. For the first time, we are seeing real critical infrastructures in Africa that are tangible, that you can see, you can feel, you can touch, and can point to the fact that the money that the country A, country B, too, is used for building this infrastructure. And that is what we need. And infrastructure is a long-term investment. So a country, again, that's why I did mention that a country can take on the money that might push it the sustainability of 100% of its GDP. But for 10 years later, based on the kind of project that the money has been invested in, that project can start offsetting the loan that it has taken from China or from any country to build that infrastructure. And by that time, the debt sustainability will come up. So when you're having a conversation today, and you say because the debt level is about 90%, 100%, therefore the country is going to be in crisis, then you are wrong because you didn't interrogate the component of that debt and what those monies were used for. So if we are seeing real tangible infrastructure for the first time in Africa, and that is why I always put it bluntly, yes, there are challenges in every relationship like we have with the West, same way with China, but there's a net positive gain when you look at infrastructure investment in Africa. And I'll tell you what, the history is very important.
Let me hold you on the positive gain. Let me hold you on the positive gain. But now let's look at it from this other side. Now in 2018, we are heading to Zambia. These are some stories that when we talk about them, we shake our heads. Zambia government handed over the country's national electric company, ZESCO, to China, thanks to the fact that they could not pay their loan. They were unable to meet the loan repayment. Now, before that particular time, they also lost their broadcast company, ZNBC. And there was also this big rumors that they were going to lose the airport in Lusaka. At this point in time, are we safe?
So these are all stories that do not hold water when it comes to the debt conversation, when it comes to China in Africa. And these are parts of the earlier thing that I mentioned about the debt trap diplomacy as they talk about. And that is a narrative that says that China selects vulnerable countries around the world. You know, Sri Lanka, they mentioned Sri Lanka, of course, in most countries in Africa, that they believe do not have the capacity to pay money owed to them, and they keep giving to them to trap them. And then when they are unable to pay, then they take on their assets to manage for them. In fact, China has not taken any country's asset to manage in any country in the world. In fact, in most cases, they are able to restructure some of the loans that they own. In for the first time, that you have a country that you owe majority of the debt to, that has allowed you to structure debt with. Because when you talk about debt restructuring, the Bretton institution, they are not at the levels of the kind of money that this country owes to China. We talk about these are billions of dollars. In fact, at some point, China actually forgives some of the debt that are owed to some of these countries. Now, the issue about the debt trap that has fed into, that does not even allow us to have a candid conversation about the debt when it comes to China, or the loans that countries owe to China, is that it makes you feel that countries in Africa, in fact, do not have a say in the kind of loans that they take from China. It's more like Beijing just picks you, country A, and then drops money on you, take it, and then you just grab it, and then you just go and use it without thinking about it. Again, it makes you feel like the African agency is not part of the conversation when it comes to discussing deals with China. And trust me, some of these projects that I mentioned, you will go and find European companies that are involved with the local government before these monies are even released to these countries. So there's no issue about confiscating of any country's assets anywhere in the world by China or any of that sort. In fact, in most cases, they actually allow these countries to sit on the table to restructure their debt. In the case of Ghana, they did the same. They talk about Uganda, Zambia, Sri Lanka, and all these countries. It's more of trying to, there's a caution there. Nobody should dispute the fact that we have to be cautious in these loans that countries are taking on. They have to be sustainable. The project that needs the financing has to be
we are
sustainable
being
in
cautious,
itself, must
while
be
we are
viable.
being cautious and looking at these issues from a patriotic and African eye side of it, let's also ask ourselves this particular question: to what extent is corruption playing out in these Chinese loans, be it padding of this particular project when they get here, or this particular infrastructure stretching longer than it should be? Because some of these projects are also counterpart funding. Like there are several of those particular projects in Nigeria that are counterpart funding, and a project that's supposed to last a year, 2, 3 is lasting over 8, 10 years. So what role is corruption playing within the African context when it comes to Chinese loans?
There are a lot of loopholes when it comes to the kind of role that countries in Africa play when it comes to managing these debts. And of course, corruption is one of them, in terms of trying to get transparent deals that we believe is in the interests of the public. Those are issues that have come up in terms of trying to interrogate what can be done to really reduce the sort of risk that these countries are exposed to when it comes to taking on loans, whether from China or India, from the West, anywhere in the world. So corruption is a key part of what the kind of conversation. That's why I always talk about borrower responsibility. In most cases, we box all the challenges together and drop it on the source of the funding. And then we exonerate ourselves from the conversation, that as if we do not have a role to play in where we find ourselves. And that is what this old debt conversation about, when somebody says you are being trapped by another country. It's like the person is saying that you do not have a brain of your own. In fact, it was no fault of yours. In fact, you were not involved, and somebody is just luring with money. So if it falls flat on the surface, or if you find yourself in a fix, don't blame yourself. It's not your fault. It's that person that gave you the money to invest in your road and your railway and your oil infrastructure that you need. That cannot be the case. So we have own borrower responsibility is very key. In fact, in the conversation about debt, usually we exempt the African government and African leaders from this kind of conversation, which is not right. The issue about corruption, yes, corruption can be induced from the source of the funding, the kind of, the source of funding that you're getting, the corruption can be induced from there. But again, we also have to deal with our own corruption-related issues that we have, that we know, and it's a known fact that you find in some of the corrupt, when you look at the corruption perception index around the world, you're going to find majority of them in Africa. And the sort of illicit financial flow that exit the continent. In fact, the loopholes in our tax system that can help us, block some of these funding that we are losing to invest in our critical infrastructure. So there's a whole lot that we need to discuss about our own responsibility as countries on the continent, that we have a responsibility towards managing this debt to the level that we believe. So taking all the money from China or India, from Europe, whatever, it's not the issue. It's about how we are being responsible enough in accepting the fact that we also have a critical role to play, and not just because we find ourselves in a crisis, therefore it is not our fault. Somebody lured me to take money and I just took it. That cannot be the case. So corruption, again, is a very key thing that we need to deal with as a continent when it comes to taking on these loans and these deals.
Thank you very much. Corruption is a key thing we have to deal with. Now, let's bring this home. For those that keep wondering, you see a whole lot of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. You see a whole lot of funding, counterpart fund. You see a whole lot of countries coming and making inroads into Africa. But the truth of the matter is this: nobody is coming here to give Africa free food, because it's non-existent. No matter the diplomacy, no matter what it is, it's all about interest. People see interest and they go to where their interest is protected and where they will make profit. It doesn't matter how the relationship is called. Now, let's now ask ourselves this question. I'm bringing that to you. For those that are representing different African countries in these forms of agreement, be it the loans, be it the signing of deals, be it in every form of these meetings, do you really see them representing Africa well? Or at the end of the day, we signed papers that those that will come after will not be happy that those that were before them signed?
Well, I think we are seeing a bit of progress in terms of the African assertiveness when it comes to dealing with powers that be, or the kind of sources that they get funding or assistance from. Now we are seeing more of African voices that are clamoring for more better engagement, better deals, and getting, taking the African perspective into consideration when it comes to the engagement with this. In fact, in the president of Xi Jinping in Beijing, that for the first time you have African leaders that were speaking on specific challenges that they believe are existing between Africa and China. For example, the issue about trade imbalance. In fact, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa in his speech mentioned that right in the presence of the Chinese president. It doesn't matter whether you are promising to offer $50 billion of development assistance to us or not. These are real challenges that we are facing that we believe has to be resolved. So in that context, I can see that now there are voices. In fact, in recent time, we saw the president of Kenya in Western quarters, the IMF meetings and all of them raising voice about how the international financial system is not favoring countries in Africa and how they need to be structured. There are conversations about currency dependency of the dollar, depend on the dollar, and how countries in Africa needs to now find a way to trade among ourselves using our local currency. These are all new nuances and voices that speaks to the fact that there's a new momentum from the representative from Africa that are trying to assert their voice, trying to push the interests of Africa. In fact, in the Beijing Declaration, as we saw, the 10-point that President Xi announced that accumulated into the $50 billion that we've all seen, you can see that almost all the issues that President Xi mentioned are issues that are raised by institutions in Africa. When you go to every major country, even at the regional or the continental level, that are raised, that these are critical issues that we have to look at for as a continent. And that was what you can see that's fed into the kind of commitment that were announced during the Beijing summit of the SOUQ. So there's a new drive in terms of the asserting of the African voices in shaping how these deals and how these pronouncements, how these initiatives are done than when usually it is just announced and just dumped on African countries. Now that's not the case. There's a series of engagement because of, again, because of the new frontiers that are emerging. Now we have the BRICS, as we all know, that's also ensuring that there's a new momentum for voices in the global south, which of course now a lot of countries in Africa are planning to join the BRICS. And of course we have the SOUQ and China being a huge front for most countries. So these are all, avenues that are giving impetus for African, perspectives to be heard and to feed into some of the final outcomes of these deals and engagement that we are seeing around the world. In fact, there are changes even at the WTO level. There are changes at the UN Security Council level. The G20, in fact, for the first time, I think last year, the African Union was accepted as a member of the G20, which is a very huge development for Africa. So I believe that these are all new changes that are welcoming, and therefore one can see that some interests are being pushed, and those interests are being fed into some of these new initiatives that we are seeing around the world concerning Africa.
Now we are rounding up. We've come to that particular time where the watch says is enough. But before we go, I just want a sentence or two from you on this particular issue. Now, the leaders are elected for the people. The people don't serve the leader. The leader is supposed to serve the people. That is what it should be. Whether that's what it is in Africa, that's a topic for another day. But now let's look at this particular loans and this infrastructure coming from China. Do you think the people should be carried along? Citizens of different African countries, for whatever infrastructure the government of the day is putting on ground, do you think the people should be carried along? Or do you think the people should also stand up and say, get this or don't get that? At what point should the point and the voices of the citizens of the country be heard?
I think it is the responsibility of countries to ensure that any program that they are putting on the table, dealing with any country around the world, is in the interest of their citizens. That is the first point. So if the Chinese government is dealing with the Ghana government, they assume that the Ghana government represents the voices of the Ghanaians, and therefore they are dealing in the interest of the Ghanaian populace. That is the first point. They have no hand in deciding on what the people of Ghana want, because they believe that what the people of Ghana want is what the government of Ghana represents. So that responsibility is on the African countries themselves to ensure that before they table any sort of program line to engage any country, whether it's from the Europe, from Asia, from the Middle East, whatever, dealing with other African countries, that these issues and programs that represent the interests of their citizens. That's the bottom line. When you're dealing at the highest level in terms of government to government, the people are not involved. They cannot be involved at that level. It is you sitting across the table with representative of another country, let's say China, and they believe that you are there because of your people that you represent. And therefore, whatever you're putting on the table is the interest of it. So that responsibility really relies on the countries that are going on the table to negotiate these deals with these countries, whether China, India, or Europe, or whatever. So we have to ensure that we have to advocate for government to almost always represent the interests of their citizens. Because if not, then we're going to sell ourselves short in some of these engagements without.
Thank you very much, Mr. Paul. We've had the Executive Director of Africa and China Center for Policy and Advisory, Mr. Paul Frimpong, on SOUQ Paulse for the first time. And it's been our honor for every member of the crew and myself. And we look forward to having you again. Thank you very much for being a guest on SOUQ Paulse, Mr. Paul.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now, to everyone out there, let's get this fact straight. It doesn't matter how much your country is owing. It doesn't matter how much they will owe tomorrow. But know this, you are a part and a responsibility is yours to make sure that your voice counts. So whatever the infrastructure is, talk about it. Wherever it's going to be situated, talk about it. If the loans are getting high, talk about it. If there's any form of restructure, talk about it. We can't keep quiet. We can't afford to keep quiet because our silence is expensive, very expensive. Now, for every other person out there, you have a representative in your various houses, National Assembly, whatever you call it in your country. Get this and get it right. If we say we need to build infrastructure in Africa, is to get us productive. And that must be done not just well, but timely. We can't lose time. and lose production and lose productivity all at the same time. So it's my responsibility, it's your responsibility to keep talking. Hold your elected leaders accountable. That's the first point of being productive. That is why they are elected. And don't keep quiet. My name is SOUQ, John Rogers SOUQ. It's been my pleasure having you on this program today, and on behalf of me, myself, and the very beautiful crew that bring this to you on daily basis, except the weekends. I want to say thank you very much for hanging in there. Remember, follow us on our social media handles, SOUQ TV, on all social media handles, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, SOUQ News TV, and send in every single thing you think you've missed or want to hear or respond or you're not happy about, and somebody will definitely reply. Follow us and we'll follow you back. It's been a pleasure having you here today. I will say thank you very much. Have yourself a beautiful, beautiful evening. And remember, be your brother's keeper. Bye.